we're going to begin a little differently tonight. Not with the newsmakers, but with you. Many of you have contacted us since Politico published that Supreme Court draft opinion on Roe versus Wade. Deciding whether or not to have an abortion is deeply personal, but some of you shared your stories about the circumstances, the thought processes, and the final decisions you made. Thank you to everyone who responded. Before we get the latest on abortion rights from Capitol Hill, let's begin with some of your stories and fair warnings. Some of them may be rather difficult to hear, but we think it's important to ground this political debate in the lives of real people. Like Jill, here's what she left in our inbox.
I'm a sexual abuse survivor and a rape survivor. I have had numerous abortions. I'm ashamed to say it, but everyone needs to hear the story about how a little girl was repeatedly raped and violated in every way that you can think of. An abortion gave me the opportunity to get my life together without screwing up another little life. I'm terrified for the women who won't have that opportunity. And I would love to speak with someone about what systemic abuse does to a woman's ability to choose whether or not to have sex and whether or not to have an abortion, and what society does to women who find themselves in a situation where they are systemically abused by society and men.
Jill, what you went through is horrifying, but your courage is really inspiring. Even the willingness to speak something that I'm sure has been so shameful and so painful for so many years. I'm really sorry you had to go through that, but Jill, thank you so much for sharing that story. Now here's what Christy had to say. Watch.
I was very young and entered into a very abusive relationship. I was beaten, almost shot twice. Unfortunately, in the 80s, they did not recognize relationship rape. I became pregnant, and I made the choice to terminate my pregnancy. After that, I married a fantastic man, was married for 20 years. He even became a police officer. I live with it every day. I have no regrets because it would have been no life for a child. He would have terrorized us and probably killed us, unfortunately.
Wow. Christy, again, difficult situation, but I know that your story is going to touch someone in our audience who heard it for the first time. So honored that you trusted us with that story. Thank you so very much. Stories like these reflect why the Biden administration appears determined to maintain abortion rights. Attorney General Merrick Garland said as much during a press conference today.
The Justice Department has steadfastly been committed to defending the right to abortion. If the law changes, we will address appropriate next steps at that time. But what will not change is our commitment to defending the rights of women and all Americans.
Meanwhile, Senate Democrats are moving toward writing Roe v. Wade's protections into law. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says the Senate will have a procedural vote next Wednesday for the Women's Health Protection Act. Now, to be clear, that's not a vote on the bill itself. It's a vote to see if the Senate can even move forward on this bill. But based on how the measure has fared before, success seems unlikely. And let's be real. There's really only one way to ensure abortion rights for sure: amend the Constitution. So absent that, what's next? NBC Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Rafa joins us now with more on that. And Ali, give us a little more context on what this vote Wednesday will mean in terms of the Democrats' efforts.
Yeah, well, Joshua, during that presser, you heard Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer say that this vote will be one of the most significant that Democrats do take in this century. You heard from several different Democratic senators just saying how important this vote will be, how important it is that they are actually acting on this, that they're not just letting this pass. And they're saying that despite there not being the numbers, they're aware that they don't have the numbers to actually take action because obviously they don't have the 60 votes to nuke the filibuster or change the filibuster rules as a single party. They're saying it doesn't matter. At the very least, they will be able to get Democrats and Republicans in the same room and have them on the record basically taking a stance on where they stand on abortion and abortion rights. They say this is something that's going to follow them through the midterms. And despite them not being able to take action, just being realistic with their abilities here, they're saying this is something that they are going to keep at the top of minds of voters leading into November, that abortion rights are on the ballot, Joshua.
What about the landscape of legislation that's being contemplated for this? Is the Women's Health Protection Act the only bill that's pending right now, or are lawmakers considering other options as well?
So that is the best shot they have. There is the Women's Health Protection Act, and then you have Senators Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, who have their own unique version of this bill. So right now, that is their best bet to get this done. But Senate Majority Leader, as you said, Chuck Schumer, said that they are going to take this up for a vote next week. The big question now is, what exactly is this legislation going to look like? Because we saw the Women's Health Protection Act pass in the House last February and then not make it to a vote in the Senate after Senator Joe Manchin sided with Republicans and a debate wasn't taken up on this bill. So the question now is, what is this draft going to look like? We know that we've heard from Senators Murkowski and Collins, and they've said that they have an issue with some of the wording in the current draft as it stands, that some of the wording explicitly states that there could be punishments or penalties for health providers who are refusing to provide abortions based on their religious beliefs. Then you're hearing from Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer in that presser, who also mentioned that that is false. This new version of the bill will not include that language. And so what we're really looking out for now is, come next week, what are they actually going to vote on? As you said, that this is largely symbolic, but what is it actually going to look like? Because at the end of the day, Democrats are realistic here. They know that they don't have the votes to get this done, but at the very least, like I said, they can get all senators on the record with at least where they stand on this issue.
And before I got to let you go, that's what Senate Democrats are doing. I wonder what Senate Republicans are up to. We know the former Vice President Mike Pence spoke tonight at the gala of a group called the Carolina Pregnancy Center. Among other things, just according to an early transcript of his remarks, he said, quote, "We gather today on the verge of what may be a new era in American history, an era in which all human life is once again cherished and respected." What do we know about how Republicans are preparing for whatever legal fights may be to come?
Yeah, so one ripple effect of this leaking of this draft has been this reckoning over where candidates stand, where lawmakers stand in general on abortion and abortion rights, abortion legislation. And what we're seeing now is Democrats and Republicans coming out and put each party on defense ahead of the midterms, putting them in corners that they know won't look good to voters of their party come fall. So you saw the National Republican Senatorial Committee come out with new polling, new messaging yesterday and today. And I'm going to read you some quotes from this messaging that came out. The National Republican Senatorial Committee is saying that GOP candidates should, quote, portray themselves as, quote, compassionate consensus builders. They say they should target Democrats for, quote, extremist views and having an obsession over abortion rights. According to this memo, the committee also wants candidates to say they will, quote, not take away contraception or, quote, women's health care, and say that they are restricting late-term abortions, and they say that that is a reasonable consensus opinion. So as we go forward with this, the next days and weeks, you're going to see that there is definitely messaging behind everything Republicans and Democrats are saying, those are Republican candidates. The Republicans who have already been elected and are lawmakers on Capitol Hill largely are not commenting on this. If they are commenting on the leak of this draft, they're sticking to the talking point of investigating how it was leaked and just the larger problem with leaks in the Supreme Court rather than the striking of abortion rights. Joshua.
Thank you, Ali. That's NBC Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Rafa starting us off tonight. Now, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, some expect the demand for abortion pills to rise. These medications are considered a safe and effective way to end an early pregnancy without surgery. It's a 2-pill regimen, and depending on where one lives, doctors can prescribe them in the first 11 weeks of pregnancy. Certain states allow telemedicine prescriptions. Many state legislatures have tried banning these pills from being shipped or prescribed. 19 states, as you can see, already restrict them from being prescribed through telemedicine, including Texas, Arizona, and Kentucky. Basically, every state from the Dakotas down through Texas. Now, if Roe goes away, many experts believe restrictions for abortion pills could get even tighter. Let's continue now with Jennifer Haberkorn, a congressional reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Ms. Haberkorn, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Joshua.
Could you just give us a quick basic introduction to these pills for people who aren't familiar with them? What are they and how are they used?
Sure. As you mentioned, this is 2 medications that when taken in succession, they mimic an early miscarriage and end a pregnancy. The FDA didn't approve this drug until 2000, and it took kind of a long time for it to gain some attention. But since then, actually in the year 2020, the medication abortion surpassed in-clinic procedures as the most common method of abortion in the United States.
Your piece in the LA Times refers to this as the next battleground, potentially in a future post-Roe v. Wade, presuming, of course, that Roe v. Wade is overturned. Elaborate on that. What do you mean by that?
So to your point earlier about how, if Roe is overturned, we are going to see more demand for medication abortion. Already we're seeing, as I mentioned in 2020, the demand for medication abortion has risen, particularly early in pregnancy when it can be effective. That's when you can obtain it from a doctor. But if Roe is overturned, we're going to see, at least the experts predict, that we're going to see women in states where abortion is banned or severely curtailed try to obtain these pills. And as of right now, you are able to get them outside of, going to a doctor's office and getting a prescription. There's websites that have popped up in recent years where you can obtain these pills from India, or you can see a physician in Europe who will write a prescription for you. That's not technically allowed in most states, and it's not, the FDA doesn't like importation of drugs from foreign countries, but the experts that I talk to predict that, women in a state where abortion is banned are going to be turning to these methods to try to get the drugs because they feel like they have no other option. And if you recall, pre-Roe, this option didn't exist. Medication abortion was not yet illegal. Obviously, the internet was not widely used in the way it is today. So they kind of view this as the modern day home remedy that, some women are going to have to turn to. As you mentioned, it's very safe, it's very effective, but there are risks attached to it. If an abortion is not entirely successful, then that patient will need to see a doctor and get that addressed. There are also legal risks. We only a couple states right now criminalize medication abortion, but a lot of experts expect that number to increase as states are given more authority by the Supreme Court to regulate early abortions. And,
right.
We've seen patients be criminalized. There was a woman recently in Texas who was arrested, and that case was eventually dropped, but certainly that was a lot of trauma for a situation in which she did nothing illegal.
So are we looking at more legislation to try to ban medication abortions on the horizon? We've talked a lot about trigger laws that are set to take effect the minute that Roe v. Wade ceases to be law, if indeed that happens. Are we looking at a similar wave of legislation, or perhaps conversely, legislation to protect medication abortion if Roe v. Wade is overturned?
That's going to depend entirely on the state in which you live in. The states that oppose abortion already are, well expected to continue along that path and try to pursue legislation that either makes it obtain medication abortion or criminalizes the activity. Traditionally, anti-abortion groups have not chosen to criminalize the patient for obtaining an abortion. Typically, they go after the physician who does so. But the experts that I've talked to and abortion rights supporters fear that the criminalization of the patient could be that next step. And certainly in states that, are expected to preserve abortion rights, are expected to broaden their access to medication abortion, although that really isn't an issue in those states right now. There are very few regulations that prohibit that access.
And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but I just wonder, in terms of these medications, if they become harder to get, that seems to open up markets for potential counterfeiters, especially online counterfeiters. We know how social media has gotten more involved in terms of the selling of all kinds of different medication, from mental health to erectile dysfunction pills. So it feels like there's a big gray area that could open up with these kinds of medications, depending on what happens next.
That's exactly right. I mean, if we see Roe fall, as we expect in that draft that circulated on Monday night, that's certainly a fear of abortion rights supporters, that you're going to have women who are turning to, really underground methods, and counterfeit medication is certainly a risk of that. The websites that exist today are really well researched by abortion rights supporters. They, will order these prescriptions from India that are available on their websites. They'll test them, they'll ensure that they're safe, and they have a pretty good record. But certainly, it's pretty easy to set up a website. It's pretty easy to say, this is an abortion pill and, give me $200 for it. And I think that's a real concern that that's going to happen.
Jennifer Haberkorn of the Los Angeles Times, appreciate you making time for us tonight. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
We will share more of your stories in just a moment, and we'll hear from the head of Planned Parenthood in California. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. Each abortion represents a unique set of people, circumstances, and convictions. They're not just statistics. Still, the stats do help paint a picture of who the Supreme Court's upcoming ruling will affect. From 2015 to 2019, the U.S. averaged about 890,000 abortions per year. That's among women under 49. This means that roughly 12 out of every 1,000 women in the U.S. had an abortion. Now, these numbers come from the Guttmacher Institute. That's a group that collects abortion statistics and advocates legal abortion. Some women end up aborting their first pregnancies, but according to the CDC, 6 out of every 10 women who have an abortion are already mothers. The latest estimates also show that abortions are declining in the last few years. Let's share one more story of thinking through an abortion. Caroline writes, "This is the first time I've told my story outside of friends, but with Roe being in such jeopardy, I feel like I have to speak out. I had an abortion when I was barely over 20. I was working in a bar, totally broke, really unhealthy, using substances, and generally unfit to become a parent. I struggled and struggled with my choice. It wasn't easy, especially with my strict Christian upbringing. I went to a Planned Parenthood where the pregnancy was confirmed, and then to a crisis pregnancy center where I was met with nothing but a stick to pee on and judgment. Ultimately, I knew what I had to do. Fast forward 15 years later, I am a wife, mother to 2, and a social worker. I took my new chance at life and made the most of it. Without my abortion, none of this would have been possible." Caroline, thank you very much for sharing your story. Let's share some more of your stories and questions with Jodie Hicks, the president and chief executive of Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California. She recently wrote an op-ed for the LA Times called "Why I'm Telling My Abortion Story Now." Ms. Hicks, welcome. Good to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
I wonder, based on the op-ed that you wrote and also on the story from Caroline, that we just shared, what your reflections are in terms of the impacts, the real world lived impacts that making this decision can have on women in a variety of ways.
I mean, I think it's so important right now to tell your story. We launched a website, sayabortioncalifornia.com, and it was really why I decided to tell my story. I didn't feel comfortable asking other people to do that if I wasn't willing to do it myself. And my story is typical of most, which is I wasn't ready at that time, and it has, what I know, it's afforded me the life that I have now, and it's a life that I believe I deserve, and everybody's decision is valid. And I go through all of the feelings that I think everyone's feeling right now, from real rage and anger to being really, really sad for all of us and for the next generation. And I don't want us to have to tell our most vulnerable stories and put our most private decisions out there. But the fact is that we have stigmatized abortion. We have called it all different words so that we can attach shame and blame and all of those things. And I think it's really what led us to where we are today, where people are making decisions that really affect people's lives, their health, their dignity, and the trajectory of their very futures.
In your story, you write that your mother drove you to the clinic, paid for the service, and cared for you when you got home, that you had the benefit of a supportive family and an uncomplicated abortion, but you said it remained a nearly taboo subject. And you wrote in the LA Times that you to this day do not know if your father knows that you had an abortion. Your mother obviously knows, but to this day, you don't know if your dad knows. How does that sit with you? A number of the people who shared their stories with us wrote or said in their voicemails that they were telling this for the first time. And as you heard from one of the stories tonight, they weren't sure if the people closest to them even knew.
Yeah, again, a wide range of emotions. And I did call my mother. And part of that story is my auntie went with her and supported my mother while my mother supported me. And I was a teenager with all of those complicated feelings and relationships at the same time. And I did call my mother the day before the story was coming out. And it's interesting, I'm 50 years old now, and it still felt like my 16-year-old self calling my mom. But the first thing she said to me was, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry that I didn't talk about it more with you. And I'm sorry that I didn't ask you more how you were doing. And my response was, everything I wrote is the truth and how I feel, which have nothing but gratitude that she was able to be there for me. And now in the position that I'm in today, I hear all of the stories of people that are having to travel outside of the state they live in, are having to navigate this very complicated and now hostile public health system in order to get access to services. And I just have nothing but gratitude. The truth is, she never did tell my dad, and we haven't talked about it. And I hope for a better conversation. I hope for a better future for the next generation, and certainly for my daughters, on understanding that healthcare is essential, including abortion, that every decision is valid and should be made with their doctor, and can be a conversation with loved ones to get the support that everyone deserves.
I know I've only got you for a few more minutes, but I did want to get to one note from Gladys. Gladys writes, in part, as a mixed-race woman who was raised on abstinence, I found myself in situations where I had no other choice but to abort, because I realized my precarious situation was unsuited for rush reality, particularly men, even though birth control would be in the back of my mind. Many black women find themselves against all odds, where not only do they have to care for themselves, they got very little social support, especially in a pregnancy situation. During pregnancy and childcare, a woman needs shelter, community, financial and living support, etc. These necessities are often at the minimum, which creates a juggling endeavor at the moment a woman is in greatest needs for them. I got to let you go in just a minute, but I wonder what your sense is in California of how communities of color, of which there are many in the state of California, might be affected by this. I can imagine that your group is talking to, Black women in Baldwin Hills differently than you might be talking to Asian communities on the peninsula, different than you might be talking to Latino migrant workers in the Central Valley. It feels like there is an array of different constituencies for your group to deal with right now.
Absolutely, and that's inclusive in the types of care and the types of outreach that we give in meeting each patient where they are and spreading messages out to communities. But I mean, I think it's important to note that any kind of barrier to healthcare, especially abortion, always disproportionately affects women of color, women of low incomes. And, we have to credit Black women who have been the leading voice of why we don't say pro-choice as much anymore, because it's not always a choice for people. And it's why we talk about abortion rights and really reproductive justice. And it's Black women that have led that charge because of that intimate understanding that it's not always a choice. There's many, many factors in why people make these decisions and why there's such an important need for people to have access to the care that they need when they need it.
I can give you 10 real skinny seconds to just elaborate on that statement. When you say for many Black women, it's not a choice, what do you mean by that? Very briefly.
I think it's for many women, if you don't have access to family leave and childcare and health care, and in Mississippi, the state where this is being heard in front of the Supreme Court, there's only one healthcare provider, and it's truly a very dangerous place to be pregnant. And so those are not free choices. Those are important decisions people make for their families and their very health.
Jodie Hicks, President and Chief Executive of Planned Parenthood Affiliates of California. Appreciate you making time tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks again to everyone who shared their personal stories with us. These are so hard to hear and they're so hard to read, but they mean so much. And regardless of your views on this, hearing these stories makes a difference. So if you feel so inclined, please feel free to share more of them. We'd love to know what factored into your decision to have an abortion or not. And if you had not made that choice, whatever choice you made, how might your life be different today? We also welcome your questions about abortion in America. And again, regardless of your politics, your views on abortion, your knowledge level about it, none of that matters. We just want to hear from you. So reach out to us by voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us now tonight at NBCnews.com. We're kind of bypassing social media for this mostly just because these are such sensitive stories. And if you do share your story, feel free to let us know if there are any particularly sensitive details that we should keep private. Up next, we will have an update from Ukraine and more on how U.S. intelligence is shaping the war. We are live from Kyiv just ahead. Stay close. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been steadily requesting weaponry from the U.S. to fight Russia. We're learning more tonight about how strong a weapon information can be. According to the New York Times, U.S. intelligence has helped Ukraine target and kill Russian generals. Now, the Times cites unnamed officials in its reporting, but Ukrainian officials say they've killed about a dozen Russian generals in all. The Times reports that number has stunned military analysts. That reporting is getting some strong pushback, including from the Pentagon.
The United States provides battlefield intelligence to help Ukrainians defend their country. We've talked about that quite a bit. We do not provide intelligence on the location of senior military leaders on the battlefield or participate in the targeting decisions of the Ukrainian military. The Ukrainians have, quite frankly, a lot more information than we do. This is their country, their territory, and they have capable intelligence collection abilities of their own.
Also, the National Security Council called the Times report misleading and irresponsible. It reiterated that point about, quote, not providing intel with the intent to kill Russian generals, unquote. Now, NBC News has yet to corroborate that report. But we can report exclusively tonight that U.S. intelligence has helped Ukraine launch attacks. And that includes the sinking of the Russian flagship Moskva a few weeks ago. The American government helped confirm its location, after which the Ukrainians targeted the ship. NBC national security correspondent Ken Delanian has more on the nuances of intelligence sharing. Hey, Ken.
Joshua, American officials are saying tonight that they are not providing intelligence to Ukraine that is specifically tied to the location or activities of Russian generals or other leaders. In fact, two U.S. officials tell NBC News there is a specific directive forbidding them from doing that. It's worth remembering that an executive order prohibits U.S. officials from helping or engaging in assassination. Now, what the U.S. is doing, Joshua, is sharing battlefield intelligence with Ukrainian forces, as NBC News reported a couple of weeks ago. And that intelligence has been a big part of Ukraine's success in fending off this Russian invasion. Now, American officials don't dispute that in some cases, Ukraine has used some of that intelligence to mount attacks that have killed Russian generals. As many as 12 Russian generals are believed to have died in Ukraine. By the way, you would rarely see American generals spending a lot of time in forward areas of combat zones, but the Russian military fights differently than ours does. Lower-level commanders are not empowered to make their own decisions, so Russian generals have to go to the front, which exposes them to attack. But the bottom line here is that the U.S. is sharing intelligence with Ukrainian forces that is helping them attack and kill Russians, including Russian generals. But American officials say there is no specific targeting of generals by the United States. In fact, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said today that the U.S. does not provide intelligence on the location of senior military leaders on the battlefield. But it's also true that the U.S. has provided intelligence that Ukraine has used to launch attacks, some of which killed Russian generals. That may seem like a subtle distinction, but it's an important one for American officials. Joshua?
Thank you, Ken. That's NBC National Security Correspondent Ken Delanian. Meanwhile, another White House delegation is heading to the Ukrainian border. Not President Biden, but perhaps the person closest to him. The First Lady, Dr. Jill Biden, will visit the area for Mother's Day. Her itinerary includes stops in Romania, which is just south of Ukraine, and Slovakia, to the west, before going to the Ukrainian border. She plans to meet with Ukrainian refugees and U.S. troops. Dr. Biden could well get even closer to the Ukrainian border than President Biden did during his visit to Poland back in March. NBC's Cal Perry joins us now from Kyiv, and let's start with the First Lady getting close to an active war zone. Talk about the message that's meant to send, the benefits that's meant to bring, and also some of the security considerations involved.
Well, the security considerations certainly will be first and foremost on mind for U.S. officials. She'll be visiting, as you said, that border with Slovakia. The messaging behind it is because that is the easiest border in many ways for refugees to cross. More than 8 million people have fled this country, and the First Lady wants to put focus on the plight of those people. The United Nations has camps set up there. You can expect that to be a part of the photo op. But the bigger message, clearly one that is not just important to the United States and the First Lady, but important to the Ukrainian president as well. He had a chance to speak about the importance of the visit today. Here's a little bit of what he said.
It's very important because, you know, in our minds, in our society, the President Biden is the president of the biggest democratic civilization for Ukrainians.
Returning people to their homes is front of mind for the president and for officials here across the country. Of the 7.7 million people displaced, for example, Joshua, about 15% of them are trying to make their way home. It is that broader picture, certainly the impact on Europe as well, that you can expect the First Lady to address over this weekend visit.
These New York Times reports about U.S. intelligence helping target Russian officials. How are the Ukrainians and the Russians responding to those reports, as well as our reporting about the sinking of the Moskva?
So we haven't had direct response yet, but I think this report is hugely significant, and certainly it is significant in the fact that we are openly discussing the assistance that the United States is giving to Ukraine on the ground. The Russians don't distinguish the difference really between sharing the information with Ukrainian forces and then the attack that happens downrange, as military officials would say. So that distinction without a difference, sort of concern that you heard Ken Delanian talking about, I think will be a topic of discussion. Now, the Foreign foreign minister of Russia has continued to call this a proxy war. Every time he gives an interview, every time he gives a statement, he talks about America fighting this war against Russia through Ukrainian forces. So it will certainly play into that narrative. I don't think anyone is surprised, and certainly officials here on the ground don't deny that there is that close intelligence relationship. But officials here in Ukraine are much more vague when they talk about attacks. Take the attacks that have taken place in Russia, across the Russian border in the last week. You know, the only direct comment we've had really came from the foreign minister, and he said that it was an act of karma. Didn't take any credit for the attacks at all. So the Ukrainian government is much more cagey, is much more, I think, secretive about the means of which they use to attack the Russians. They certainly boasted about 12 generals being killed, but they didn't get into the details of it. And I think it speaks to the difference, too. Of course, the Ukrainians are on the ground fighting. There is an immediate sort of in-your-face war, and the Americans are certainly behind the scenes sharing this intelligence. So, you know, again, it's interesting that we're talking about it, not necessarily that the intelligence was shared, Joshua.
And briefly, with regards to what's happening on the ground, the attack on that steel plant in Mariupol that has continued, where does that stand right now, and what does that mean for evacuation attempts?
So it seems about where we were 24 hours ago, which is we've lost contact once again, or at least the government has lost contact with folks that are in that plant. Last we heard from them as a network was about 6 or 7 hours ago. One of our producers actually in Lviv got a message from one of the commanders who said it's an incredibly, quote, difficult situation. We know that the fighting is fierce. It's within that plant structure. We don't know the fate of those civilians who are trapped inside. The last figure that we had of wounded was in the hundreds, and again, at least 30 children, according to the mayor, are still in that compound. But again, all we know is that communication is up and it's down, and that the fighting is fierce around that last holdout, Joshua.
Thank you, Cal. That's NBC's Cal Perry with the latest tonight from Kyiv. Our headlines tonight begin on Wall Street with a major downturn. It was, in some ways, the worst day on the markets since 2020. The Dow Jones ended the day down about 1,000 points. The Nasdaq dropped 5%. The S&P down about 3.5%. This comes after the Federal Reserve raised interest rates by 0.5 point yesterday. At first, the stock market rallied on that news. By this morning, it seemed investors had a change of heart, and by noon, Wednesday's gains had all but been erased. One possible reason, as one analyst told the Washington Post, there is still too much uncertainty over inflation. The White House will make some history with its new press secretary. Today, the administration announced that Karine Jean-Pierre will get the job. She's currently the principal deputy press secretary, and Ms. Jean-Pierre will be the first black person and the first LGBTQ person to hold that position. The current press secretary, Jen Psaki, plans to leave the job next Friday. The two of them were together at today's White House press briefing.
This is a historic moment, and it's not lost on me. I understand how important it is for so many people out there, so many different communities that I stand on their shoulders, and I have been throughout my career. And so it is an honor and a privilege to be behind this podium.
Karine Jean-Pierre was born in the Caribbean island of Martinique and raised in New York. She's been with the Biden administration since the beginning. In Virginia, testimony continued today in Johnny Depp's $50 million defamation lawsuit against his ex-wife, Amber Heard. Today was Ms. Heard's second day on the stand. She alleged that Mr. Depp physically abused her. At one point, she claimed that he became violent on a flight from Boston to Los Angeles back in 2014. She says he had become jealous and angry over her relationship with her co-star at the time, actor James Franco.
My back is turned to him, and I feel this boot in my back. He just kicked me in the back. I thought to myself, I don't know what to do. I can't believe he just kicked me. No one said anything. No one did anything. It was like you could hear a pin drop on that plane.
Amber Heard's testimony comes after 13 days of testimony from Johnny Depp's legal team. Mr. Depp also alleged physical and emotional abuse from his former spouse. The trial stems from an op-ed Ms. Heard wrote in the Washington Post back in 2018. She described herself as a public figure representing domestic abuse. And hey, thank you for making time for us. Stay tuned to NBC News Now for our report on the black church and the Democratic Party. It is the focus of tonight's edition of Meet the Press Reports at 10:30 p.m. Eastern. You can also watch on demand tomorrow in the news section of Peacock. We are still welcoming your questions and stories about Roe v. Wade by voicemail or via email. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. We will see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.